Evening's program, and this evening I'll share some experiences, some lessons learned from Swami Kriyananda. And let me lay a little bit of background for what I wish to share this evening. And that is leading up to the time when Swami Kriyananda found the autobiography of a yogi and became a disciple of Yogananda ji. This was 1948 in America. And at that time, after a long economic depression and war, the economy there was booming, and many soldiers had returned from the war and were now working, raising families, and this economic boom was, everyone was enthusiastic about getting ahead in a material way. And that is everyone except Swami Kriyananda, who was hearing a different voice. And he couldn't follow that way. To him it would be to live superficially, and he couldn't find himself doing that. He was seeking the meaning of life in a deeper way. And there was no established mechanism unless he were to join an established Christian monastery. There was no socially acceptable way for him to follow this inner seeking. And so it took him a great deal of courage to follow his own inner voice. And myself, about 20 years later, it was much easier for me to take the steps that I did that led to led up to meeting Swamiji. And my generation were almost universally rejected the values of our parents' generation, of Swamiji's generation. And generally our parents now were also relatively well-to-do, and so we had the luxury to reject what they had given us. And we had the luxury, like me, to drop out of university, knowing that with a little vocational training, one could get a good job. Even an unskilled worker could look forward to buying a house and raising a family. And we saw how our parents' generation had messed up and started wars and destroyed the environment and destroyed the social fabric in many ways. And we were very idealistically looking for a better way to live. And for some people, that also led in spiritual directions. And still, until that time, Yogananda ji had paved the way for a spiritual revolution, but it didn't really start until the late 60s. And there was just a certain something in the air. At that time, a number of gurus in India sent their disciples. Swami Shivananda sent a number of his direct disciples to the West to start their missions. One of them spoke at the Woodstock Music Festival, and they started to gain a following among young people. And it was at this time also that people like Swami Rama and Osho, the ISKCON movement, many others, Sufi teachers, Tibetan and Zen Buddhist teachers, all started their missions. And in San Francisco area, where I met Swamiji, and also the city of Vancouver in Canada, where I lived before I came to California, were particularly centers of this spiritual activity that was just beginning in a very informal way. Interestingly, Swamiji at that time was living in San Francisco after he was separated from his guru's organization in 1962. He lived on and off with his parents, who at that time lived in the San Francisco area. And then Swamiji had his own apartment, which in 1967, Nayaswami Jyotish came to that apartment and was Swamiji's first student, who stayed with him for all of these decades and is now his spiritual successor. And for Swamiji, the search that he had, he needed to find clarity in just what he was looking for. And interestingly, what he also needed in order to reach that clarity is solitude, is a time for introspection and a place for introspection. And then once he knew what he was searching for, he needed the courage to find that goal, to follow that goal. After dropping out of university, he started to feel that, well, he was brilliant and a very good writer. He thought, well, now maybe I could write plays, and in some way they could help uplift humanity, and that might be a way that I would be able to serve others if I became a playwright. And so he went to study how to be a playwright. And it was during this period that he related some of what he was thinking of. And he said, "The question returned to me with increasing urgency. What is God?" One evening, taking a long walk into the gathering night, I deeply pondered this question. I thought, God has to be, if nothing else, a conscious being. God himself must be conscious, and having created everything, must also have produced it out of consciousness. He is consciousness, essential consciousness. We are already a part of him. Then it is up to us to receive him more completely and express him more fully. This, then, is what true religion is all about. One might, I reflected, devote his entire life to this true religion and never stagnate. What a thrilling prospect. This, then, would be my calling in life. I would seek God. I decided that there could be but one way out of my imperfections, God. I must let him guide my life. I must leave off seeking human solutions and give up defining my search in terms of human effort. I must give up writing altogether. I must give up flooding the world with my ignorance. Out of very compassion for others, I must leave off trying to help them for now. I must seek God in the wilderness, on a mountaintop, in complete solitude. I would become a hermit. And what was it I hoped to find? Happiness. I recalled the pure happiness I had known as a child. Would I ever find happiness again? Only, I thought, if I became once again simple, like a child. Only if I forsook my overly intellectuality and opened myself completely to God's love. And through acquaintances, it was just a short time later that Swamiji's path took him to reading the Bhagavad Gita and reading these words. Perfect bliss grows only in the bosom tranquilized, the spirit passionless, purged from offense, vowed to the infinite. He who thus vows his soul to the Supreme Soul, quitting sin, passes unhindered to the endless bliss of unity with Brahma. And at last in the Gita, Swamiji finds an expression of these feelings that he had within himself that seemed to come to him independently. But then he discovered that they were already written about many centuries ago. And shortly after reading the Bhagavad Gita, just a few days after, is when he finds the autobiography of a yogi and reads that book. And that becomes the magnet, and that draws him to a radical change in his life. And we can say that book was also a catalyst for him to change. That magnet, in the sense that the magnet drew him, it attracted him, but also he increased his magnetism. He increased his courage to take the step of going into the unknown, traveling across the country to meet the author of the book, and of feeling within himself that he wanted to ask Yogananda if he could become his disciple. And this was certainly a leap into the unknown, and one that took a great deal of courage. And coming back to my story, making a parallel here also, for me in my search, I knew that I had already found meditation, and I knew that that was the key to self-transformation, not only for me, but for many others. And immediately I wanted to share this with others and help them. But even in my own practice, I lacked the strength to keep up with it. I was easily influenced by other people and led astray. That I discovered how company is stronger than willpower. And I had the good fortune at that time to live with other meditators. And I wanted to always live with other meditators. And in this period also, for some months, I lived in the countryside with several groups of young people who had bought land, who were wanting a simpler life, and a simpler life close to nature, a self-sufficient life in the countryside, and some of them were also spiritually inclined. Some of them wanted to live together in a community. And to me, I wanted to bring together all the elements of living with other meditators in a spiritual community, in the country that also strove to be self-sufficient. And I could see how this could be a living laboratory for spiritual principles and applying them in our lives, and that it could be an example for the rest of society to follow in different ways. These ideas were already very clear in my mind before, a short while later, I read Swami Kriyananda expressing these same concepts very clearly. And for me, clarity, it meant solitude, to reach that point of clarity, and it took courage for me to go from Canada to California, and then it took, my clarity became more and more defined. Once I met Swamiji, that was the catalyst for me. And I realized that Ananda Village in California, which Swamiji had started. That was my goal. And I needed just the courage to actually make it there. And I say that because it wasn't quite as simple as just walking in. It was not an ashram in the traditional sense, where if I were accepted, my needs would be taken care of. It was more of a cooperative spiritual community. Everyone was responsible for themselves economically. They had to find a place to live and work to do. And thankfully, in the community, we created many jobs for people. At the same time, there was individual responsibility. And even once one was accepted as a member, there was a membership fee, money that went towards the purchase of the land together. That was $1,000, which I did not have. And it was difficult for me to imagine just how I would get that money. And so I didn't jump right away at wanting to live at Ananda. Even though I knew it was my direction, I was building up strength to get there. And so for me, once that clarity of moving to Ananda Village was there, I needed to build up my own magnetism and become stronger in it. And I knew I had to do that the way that all of us do, through our sadhana, through positive attitudes, through all of the teachings and techniques that our teachers have given us here. And this is the lesson that we all have. And in this way, we attract to ourselves success. And for me at that time, I stayed for a few months at a different ashram, an ashram started by one of those disciples of Swami Shivananda. And I knew it was just temporary. Even the people there knew I was heading to Ananda, and they encouraged me in that direction. And then finally, I had met a number of disciples, direct disciples of Shivananda, who had visited there and also visited Ananda village. But the founder was Swami Vishnu Devananda. He was one of the disciples. And I finally met him after being in this ashram for several months. He came to visit, and he was just not at all what I expected. The other disciples seemed very soft-spoken and very wise, and he just seemed to have a very abrasive personality. And almost as soon as he met me, it seemed like he became very angry at me. And that was the catalyst that I needed in a negative way to push me out the door and urge me on to my true home at Ananda village. And so for all of us, we want to look for those magnets that draw us towards what we want, and to create that clarity in our own minds through introspection, through solitude, and to build up our own magnetism, to gain the courage to take the steps that when we know something is right, we take them on with no hesitation. Swamiji wrote a song, and here's a phrase from it that expresses this. Swamiji wrote maybe over 400 pieces of music, but when I met him, maybe he wrote about 10 songs at the most. And this was one of them. Walk like a man, even though you walk alone. Why court approval once the road is known? Let come who will, but if they all turn home, the goal still awaits you. Go on alone. We want to have that courage when we know what the goal is to follow our hearts to that ultimate goal. Thank you all for joining me this evening.